something good happened to you recently. Maybe you finished something you had been quietly working on for months. Maybe you got the result, the promotion, the acceptance letter, or the kind of feedback. You just sat there. You let it be real for a moment. You let it belong to you before it belonged to anything else. And then it stayed yours. Silently, without a caption, without a photograph, without the announcement that apparently everyone around you seems to know how to make effortlessly. And later, maybe that same evening, maybe a few days afterward, you found yourself scrolling past someone else's post. They were announcing something smaller than what you had just done, if you're being honest. And the comments were full of fire emojis and congratulations and people typing "you deserve this" to someone they barely know. And you felt something sitting in you that was difficult to name. It wasn't jealousy, not really. It wasn't bitterness. It was something quieter and more complicated, like standing outside a party you weren't certain you even wanted to attend, watching the light through the window, not quite sure why you were still standing there. If that feeling sounds familiar, drop a yes in the comments. I want to know how many of you are watching this right now and nodding quietly to yourself. People have labels for what you do. They call it being too private, too guarded. Some of them, the ones who have read one too many self-help articles, will tell you with complete confidence that you are afraid of success, that your silence is really just self-sabotage wearing a sophisticated coat, that deep down you don't believe you deserve to be seen. This video is not going to agree with any of that, not even a little. In fact, this video is going to offer you something different entirely. Not a diagnosis, not a fix, just a clearer picture of what is actually happening inside someone like you, and why it makes far more sense than anyone has ever given you credit for. The modern assumption about success and visibility goes something like this. If you achieved something real, something meaningful, something you worked for, the natural human response is to want to share it, to announce it, to let the world witness it. The logic is almost airtight in how casually it gets repeated. Sharing is connection. Visibility is confidence. The person who stays quiet must be hiding something, from others or from themselves. This idea is so embedded in contemporary culture that most people never stop to question whether it's actually true, or whether it's simply what the platforms have taught us to believe because it serves them for us to believe it. It just gets passed around like a fact about human nature, like breathing, like something obvious and inevitable. But here is the part that doesn't fit your experience. You are not someone who struggles to share in private. You tell the people close to you when something goes well. You are not hiding your achievements from the world because you think you don't deserve them. In fact, when you sit alone with what you've built or accomplished, there is no ambivalence there. You know what it cost you. You know exactly how much work went into it. The pride is real and it's clean and it belongs entirely to you without requiring anyone else's agreement. What you don't want is to put it somewhere that feels like it will make it smaller, somewhere that will turn it into content, somewhere that opens it up to the randomness of other people's attention, where its worth will be determined not by what it actually means, but by how many strangers decided to tap a small heart-shaped button in the first second of their lunch break. That distinction between sharing with intention and broadcasting for validation is one that most conversations about social media never bother to make. They flatten everything into the same category. Public silence becomes pathology. Restraint becomes fear. And when the conversation is structured that way, it misses the entire internal architecture of how someone like you actually processes achievement, recognition, and what it means for something to carry real weight. It misses the most important thing about you. There is a moment that most high-performing, quiet people know intimately, but almost never describe out loud. It happens right after something significant goes well. There is a brief, clear window where the achievement feels whole, contained, almost sacred in its completeness. It doesn't need anything added to it. It doesn't need to be confirmed, framed, or annotated. It exists fully in that moment between you and the work and the outcome, and the experience of it is so specific and so textured that you already know, at some level you couldn't quite articulate to someone else, that posting it would puncture something. Not because you are afraid of being seen, but because you understand, with a quiet and unshakable certainty, that the experience of being witnessed by an algorithm is not the same as being witnessed by someone who actually understands what it took. And so you hold it. You carry the win quietly through your week. You might mention it once to one person in a way that feels proportional to what it actually is. and you move on to the next thing, to the work itself, to the problem that's already forming at the edges of your thinking. And the world, the scrolling, posting, announcing world, never knows what you just did. And the strange thing is that most of the time, that feels entirely right, until someone mentions that you're too humble. Until a well-meaning colleague tells you that you need to put yourself out there more. Until someone frames your silence as evidence of a wound that needs healing, and you sit there quietly not agreeing with the diagnosis, but also not quite sure how to explain the difference between a wound and a preference, between avoidance and design. The truth is that the internal experience of achievement for someone like you is considerably richer and more complex than the simplified version that social media asks you to perform. And the gap between the richness of the real experience and the flatness of what any public post could contain is not a gap you can close with better captions or more authentic storytelling. It is structural. It is the nature of compression itself, and some people feel that gap acutely enough that they simply stop trying to cross it. There is a concept in psychology called Vantage sensitivity. It was developed by researcher Michael Plewis, and the core idea is this: some people's nervous systems are calibrated to respond more intensely to environmental input, both positive and negative. They are not more fragile. They are more responsive. They pick up more signal from the same environment that others move through without particularly noticing. They process more layers from a single conversation, a single moment, a single achievement. The same event lands differently in a high-sensitivity nervous system, not louder, exactly, but deeper, more dimensional, more saturated with meaning than the external facts of the situation might seem to warrant. Now pair that with a related concept called low-latent inhibition. Latent inhibition is your brain's background filter, the automatic mechanism that decides what is worth your conscious attention and what can be safely screened out. In most people, this filter is aggressive and efficient. It identifies familiar stimuli quickly, tells the brain, already processed, move on, and keeps cognitive life streamlined. But in some people, and researchers have found this clusters heavily in people with high openness to experience, people with strong creative processing, people who tend to build unusually complex internal worlds, this filter is considerably less aggressive. More information gets through. More gets noticed. More gets held in working memory long enough to be turned over, examined, connected to something else. The person with lower latent inhibition and higher vantage sensitivity doesn't just experience an achievement. They experience the full accumulated weight of what it took to arrive at that moment. The false starts that nobody saw, the invisible hours in the early morning or the late night, the specific, quiet moment when something that had not been working suddenly did. They feel all of it at once when the result arrives. And when your experience of a success contains all of that texture and history and private meaning, reducing it to a 3-line caption and a celebratory photograph does not feel like sharing. It feels like translating a novel into an emoji. Something essential and irreducible gets lost in the compression, and you feel that loss before you even post anything, which is precisely why you often don't post anything at all. For a long time, the dominant story about human social behavior said that visibility and status signaling were universal drives, that every person at the biological level wants to be recognized as competent, successful, and worthy within their group, that the desire to announce, to demonstrate, to be seen as valuable is hardwired into us because groups needed to know who had skills, who had resources, who had demonstrated the capacity to survive and contribute. Visibility was social utility. And for most people, most of the time, this story holds. But here is what that story consistently leaves out. Not everyone in any group served the same function. In stable, complex social organisms, including early human communities, there was also profound and specific value in the individuals who processed quietly, who held information carefully before releasing it, who did not signal prematurely because in a genuine high-stakes environment, premature signaling costs more than it gains. Think about what a functioning group actually needs across time. It needs the ones who announce, who build social cohesion through visibility, who keep collective morale alive by making accomplishments public and shared. But it also needs the ones who watch, who accumulate understanding without broadcasting it, who protect the group's most valuable intelligence from unnecessary exposure until the moment when it can actually be deployed to meaningful effect. These were not the same temperament, and both were essential to the group's long-term survival. The person who never posts their wins online isn't malfunctioning against some universal human template. They are, in a very traceable evolutionary sense, expressing a temperament that in its original context represented a form of strategic depth, a restraint that protected the group's most valuable internal resources from unnecessary exposure and premature consumption. The modern version of this instinct, playing out in the theater of social media, is someone who intuitively recognizes that the platform is not a worthy container for what they have actually built. And that recognition, that quiet discernment about where to place your most meaningful experiences, is not a wound. It is, in the truest sense, a form of intelligence that has simply arrived in an era that has temporarily stopped valuing it. The standard personal branding and professional development advice for someone in your position usually sounds something like this: build in public. Document your journey. Share your wins and your losses, because vulnerability is connection and visibility is currency, and people need to see your humanity to trust your competence. And if you have ever tried any version of this advice, maybe during a period when you genuinely convinced yourself that you should be more open, more present, more willing to put yourself out there, you probably noticed something very specific happen. It didn't feel like connection. It felt like performance. And the performance didn't feel dishonest exactly, but it felt like it was being conducted at the ongoing expense of something real, like burning actual wood to make a painted fire. That feeling is not resistance to growth. It is accurate signal from a system that has learned, through direct experience, the difference between authentic expression and optimized content. The advice to share publicly assumes that the act of sharing is a neutral transmission, that the thing you share arrives on the other side of the broadcast in essentially the same condition it left you. But, for someone with the kind of deep processing architecture we have been describing in this video, sharing is never neutral. When you put something into the public domain, it enters an evaluation system that is entirely outside your control and indifferent to its actual value. Strangers will skim it in 1-3 seconds. The algorithm will categorize it and distribute it based on engagement patterns that have nothing to do with quality. Some people will engage and some won't, and the ratio will feel entirely arbitrary because it is entirely arbitrary. And the achievement, which lived so cleanly and completely inside you before you compressed it into a post, is now permanently tethered to that external feedback loop in a way that cannot be fully undone. The traditional advice also assumes, almost universally, that what is standing between you and the recognition you deserve is that not enough people know about what you've done. That the bottleneck is visibility. But for the vault person, visibility was never the bottleneck. Depth of work has always been the actual priority. The thing that genuinely matters to you is not who knows about what you built. It is whether what you build next is better than what you built last. And every hour spent managing a public narrative, crafting the right caption, monitoring engagement, performing the appropriate amount of accessible humility while also communicating genuine competence, all of that is an hour directly extracted from the activity that makes your work actually worth talking about in the first place. There is something that happens when vault people begin designing their relationship with success more deliberately and more honestly, and it is worth naming clearly so that when you encounter it, you don't mistake it for evidence that the approach is wrong. When you start genuinely trusting your own internal registration of achievement, when you stop relying on external feedback loops to confirm that something mattered, there is a period of real and sometimes uncomfortable stillness, not because the approach is failing, but because you are, in a genuine neurological sense, recalibrating a pattern of ambient seeking that has probably been running quietly in the background for years. Even people who never post their wins publicly are often unconsciously scanning for recognition in other channels. In whether a piece of work gets forwarded without prompting, in whether a particular person mentions something you built in a room you weren't in the specific energy of a meeting where you know what you brought to the outcome, and you're waiting, without quite admitting you're waiting, to see if anyone else registers it. The private archive and the selective witnessing practices will initially feel almost too quiet, too internally oriented, too self-referential in a way that can temporarily feel like isolation rather than independence. The absence of the ambient feedback loop, even a feedback loop you never fully trusted, will feel, for a time, like absence of confirmation, like you might be building something in an empty room and the emptiness is a sign that you are wrong about the value of what you are building. This is normal. It is the transition phase, and it is not pleasant, but it is not a warning sign. What replaces the ambient seeking once the transition is through is not indifference to recognition. It is a recalibration of whose recognition actually registers for you, in what context and why. The recognition stops feeling arbitrary. The celebrations, when they happen, feel proportional and real. The work starts to carry its own internal signal about whether it is going in the right direction, a signal that you can actually trust because it is not contaminated by the noise of outside opinions that never had the full picture anyway. Sit with the discomfort of the transition. Let the archive grow quietly. The solidity that comes on the other side of that period is not available through any external system. It has to be grown from the inside, and it takes the time it takes. Here is what the label givers miss entirely, and it is worth saying directly. The person who doesn't post their successes online is not withholding something from the world because they are psychologically compromised. They are exercising something that is increasingly rare and increasingly valuable in the current information environment: the capacity to have a genuine, unmediated relationship with their own inner life that is not constantly routed through external feedback for validation. In an era where attention is the primary currency and every major platform is specifically engineered to make you dependent on the dopamine loop of public recognition, to make the confirmation of strangers feel more real than your own direct experience of what you have done, the person who can do meaningful work and hold it privately, who can achieve something real and not immediately need to convert it into content that performs its own significance, is demonstrating a form of psychological self-sufficiency that the current cultural environment is actively working to erode in everyone it can reach. This is a context-dependent strength. It needs to be named as that honestly, without overclaiming. In environments that reward the performance of success over the substance of it, in rooms where visibility is the primary game and personal brand is the functional currency, your wiring will sometimes feel like a disadvantage. There are specific professional contexts where vault people are genuinely underestimated because the evidence of their depth and capability never appears in the places where the scorekeepers happen to be looking. This is a real cost, and you deserve to know about it clearly rather than having it hidden behind reassurance. There will be moments where someone with half your competence and twice your public presence gets the opportunity that would have suited you better. Knowing this matters, not so you can abandon your nature, but so you can make genuinely informed decisions about which rooms are actually structured to see what you bring, and which ones were never going to reward what you do best no matter how much you accommodated them. But here is what lives on the other side of that honest accounting. In the environments where actual quality of work is what moves things forward, where results matter more than narrative, where depth of thinking is valued over volume of output, where trust is built slowly and carefully through demonstrated competence rather than announced loudly through curated highlight reels, the vault person has a structural advantage that compounds over time. They have been building, accumulating, deepening, and protecting their best thinking for years, without the constant cognitive drainage of maintaining a public performance, without the bandwidth cost of managing how achievements are being perceived in real time, without the premature exposure of half-formed ideas to audiences who have no context to receive them and no investment in helping them develop. When the right moment arrives and the right room opens, and for people with this temperament and this quality of quiet work, it does eventually open, what they bring to that moment is not a carefully curated highlight reel. It is the whole body of work, intact, uncompressed, carrying the full weight of everything that went into building it. And that lands differently in a room that can hold it. It always does. It always has. Before you leave this video, I want to offer you something small and practical that you can actually carry with you. Not another framework, not another practice, just a way of speaking to yourself about this particular dimension of who you are, a way that is more accurate than the narrative you may have been handed by people who never fully understood what your silence was actually made of. The next time something good happens to you and you feel that familiar quiet, that instinct to hold it rather than announce it, to let it be yours before it becomes anyone else's story about you, you are allowed to say something like this to yourself. This is mine. What I just built has value that exists entirely independent of whether the right number of people saw me announce it. My silence is not fear. It is discernment. I know what this cost. I know what it means. I know exactly where it fits inside the longer story of the work I am doing. The people who matter in my life and in my work will encounter the evidence of this over time, in context, in the ways that actually allow them to understand what it represents. I will share this when sharing serves something real, when the context is right, when the audience has the frame to receive it, when the act of sharing adds something rather than subtracting from the completeness of what I have built. Until then, I will let it be what it is, evidence that I am capable of the thing I set out to do. And I will carry that forward, quietly and with full confidence, into whatever I am building next. That is the whole script. You will find your own version of it, in your own voice, but find it, say it specifically. Because the story you tell yourself about your silence, whether you frame it as failure or as design, as fear or as discernment, as a wound or as a choice, will determine whether the quiet remains a source of steady, private confidence that compounds over time, or whether it gradually becomes the loneliness of someone who never quite gave themselves permission to be proud of what they have spent their life building. If what we talked about in this video landed somewhere quiet and accurate for you, not in a loud, validating way, but in the way that something genuinely true tends to arrive, there is a short written guide in the description below that goes a little deeper into the Vault framework and how to apply it in your specific situation. It is free. It is not a course, not a program, not anything designed to reshape you into a more publicly oriented version of yourself. It is just a resource that might help you build a cleaner, more deliberate relationship with your own achievements and with the question of where, with whom, and when it actually makes sense to let them be seen. If what resonated most in this video was the part about processing depth, about the kind of mind that takes longer to work through things because it is working through more of them simultaneously, there is another video connected to this one that explores that territory more specifically. It is about why some people do their genuinely best thinking in solitude, why the pressure toward constant collaboration actively costs certain kinds of minds their most important output, and why the capacity to be alone with your work without that feeling like isolation or dysfunction is not something to be fixed but something to be understood and protected. The link is on the screen now, and I will see you there.